And now joining us on Book TV is Dr. Thomas Sowell of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Dr. Sowell, your most recent book, Intellectuals and Race. How do you define an intellectual?
It's someone whose whose end product is ideas, and ideas whose validation is through peer consensus rather than by any particular established procedure. In other words, a chemist would not be an intellectual by this sense because there are objective rules by which you can judge his work, or a mathematician or an engineer. But if you're a deconstructionist, the only test is whether other deconstructionists like what you're doing.
So it doesn't matter what popular opinion says about your work?
No, no.
Why not?
Because their whole career and self-esteem and all of that comes from their peers. And so it doesn't matter that they're out of step. In fact, some take great pride in being out of step.
Are you an intellectual?
I suppose you would have to say that. Since my work ends in ideas. And if people like them or don't like them, that's the way it is.
You talk about intellectuals clustering together as a whole. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's what someone once called the herd of independent minds. And they tend in a given era to believe pretty much the same things. They may change as a group from one to the other. For example, during the First World War, the intellectuals on the left were gung-ho for the First World War. After they saw the carnage of it, they all became pacifists, again, as a herd, right afterwards, and remained pacifists for the next, well, I guess perhaps to this day.
How do intellectuals cluster when it comes to race?
They've clustered different ways. Early in the 20th century, they all clustered behind the belief that genes determined everything. That some races were inferior, some were superior. And that means the people on the left, I mean, John Maynard Keynes was one of the founders of the Cambridge Eugenics Society. Many distinguished leading intellectuals of that era were absolutely dogmatic on the subject. I mean, then by the end of the century, they swung to the other end of the spectrum, again as a group. And anyone who dared to disagree with them was regarded as a racist.
Dr. Sowell, where are intellectuals clustered in your view today on race?
They're now still clustered at the end that says that all differences between groups must be due or presumptively due to mistreatment by others. And they are really pretty impervious to evidence. For example, the housing situation. When they discovered that blacks were turned down for prime mortgage loans at a higher rate than whites, instantly the media decided that was due to racial discrimination. Now, if you look at the same data from which they get the statistics on blacks and whites, and look at the statistics for Asian Americans, it undermines that completely. For example, when blacks were turned down at a rate nearly double that of whites, at the very same time, whites were turned down at a rate nearly double that of Asian Americans. Moreover, black-owned banks turned down blacks at a still higher rate than the white-owned banks did. And so you find it very hard to reconcile this with what they believe. But there's a tendency among intellectuals to have a certain set of preconceptions. And when they find numbers that seem to fit that preconception, they don't go any further. And so they have no reason to look up the data for Asian Americans, which undermines the whole argument they've made.
In your book, Intellectuals and Race, you talk about the factor of emotion in talking about race.
Yes.
How do you get rid of that factor, or can you get rid of that factor?
You can to a great extent as a practical matter. One of the things I've noticed is that in many countries around the world, people of different races can get along together, sometimes even live as neighbors for decades or even generations. And yet, when the right demagogue comes along, he can turn them against each other and they can be at each other's throats. And this has happened in India, it's happened in Sri Lanka, it's happened in Nigeria. You can run through the whole list of countries. So that it's not a wholly spontaneous thing. Many years ago, there was an old musical called South Pacific, and one of the less memorable songs was one that said, "You've got to be taught to hate." Intellectuals have taught people to hate those who are better off than themselves.
Who are some of those demagogues that you referred to?
Oh, heavens, different in different countries. Bandaranaike, I think, in Sri Lanka was one of the most painful examples. Sri Lanka was held up in the mid-century as a model of a country where people of different races got along wonderfully, and they did. They had the educated members of these two different groups, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, lived in the same neighborhoods, even though they had different religions. Each would attend the holiday services at the other person's house of worship and so on. That was fine until Bandaranaike came along and decided he wanted to be prime minister. And he then turned the Sinhalese against the Tamils. Then others of the Tamils turned them against the Sinhalese. And these people who had never had a race riot in the entire first half of the 20th century began to have riots, which then escalated into outright civil war. They went on for decades with unspeakable atrocities, and more people killed in this little country than the Americans lost during the entire Vietnam War. And so it's a scary example of how at a given time things may look very good on the surface, and yet when the right demagogue comes along in the right circumstances, people can be turned against each other with hate.
In your view, Dr. Sowell, have there been demagogues in America?
Oh yes, my gosh, it's one of the most lucrative occupations. Someone once asked me if I ever tried to convert some of the people like Jesse Jackson or others to my views. And I said, I'm sure Jesse Jackson makes 10 times what I make. How do you convince a man to reduce his income by 90%?
What's the race industry that you talk about?
Oh heavens, there's so many of them. There's the NAACP, which once played a very important role. But one of the problems with any institution that has one goal is that once they've achieved that goal, they don't say, all right, folks, we'll have a going out of business ceremony. They have to go on. The EEOC, for example, when they're there to prevent discrimination. But as discrimination declines, they have to expand the definition of discrimination so that now if you don't want to hire people who have been in prison, they think that's discrimination.
You write in Intellectuals in Race that the kind of society to which that can lead, when you talk about the race industry, et cetera, and emotion, is one in which a newborn baby enters the world supplied with pre-packaged grievances against other babies born the same day.
Yes, yes. This idea that you can redress history, which we see in a specific context in this country, it's around the world. I mean, the Czechs, when they first formed Czechoslovakia after the First World War, one of the goals they had was to redress the injustices of the 17th century. You know, nobody from the 17th century was alive at the end of the First World War. And so and they tried to take this out by having policies that would favor the Czechs over the Germans and so on. And they set in motion a chain of events in which Czechs and Germans were both worse off than they had ever been before, and both were victims of tragedy, trying to undo what happened to people who are now long dead.
Do we have policies in this country that are formed the same way?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Yeah,
we're one
such
of
as?
many affirmative action, the demand for reparations, and so on. One of the sad things is that we talk in this country as if slavery was something unique to the United States or to blacks and whites. And in point of fact, slavery was one of the oldest institutions among human beings. They go back as far as there is recorded history. And in every single part of the world, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians. For most of history, people enslaved people who were the same race as themselves for the simple reason that they simply didn't have the resources to go to another continent and take people from another continent and move them en masse someplace else. But late in history, this is what happened in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere. Many things, much of the pathology of the black community today is said to be a legacy of slavery. The irony is, if you look at facts, for example, the breakdown of the family, most black kids grew up in homes with two parents under slavery itself and for generations thereafter. And as late as the 1960s, Most black children grew up in two-parent homes. It's only when you start in with the massive Great Society, so-called, and other such things, that you see the family that had survived all of this for all this time now begin to disintegrate.
From Intellectuals in Race, Dr. Thomas Sowell, there is other evidence that the black subculture has a negative effect on intellectual achievement. In other words, brighter black students do not perform as well in settings where there are many other black students around them, contrary to the theory that what is needed in educational institutions is some larger critical mass of black students.
Yes. There are studies which I cite in there which show that. So it's not just my opinion of the whole thing. One of the studies I did many years ago was of a school, Dunbar High School in Washington, which was a very outstanding all-black academic institution. And over the years, from 1892 to 1954, something like, I forget the number now, 34, I think it was, graduates of Dunbar High School went to Amherst College. Very few at any given time, so there was never a critical mass, so-called, there. 3/4 of these kids graduated, and of those who graduated, more than 1/4 were Phi Beta Kappas. So clearly you don't need a critical mass. They never had anything resembling a critical mass. What you need is a good educational background and the absence of people who would distract you from what the real purpose of the college is.
Is there a relationship between, or an important relationship between, race and mental capacity?
Well, capacity is if you mean by capacity potential, then who knows? Because you can't measure potential currently, and I suspect for the next 100 years or so probably. But what you can recognize and measure is capacity, developed capabilities. You can measure those with SATs and stuff like that. But potential you cannot.
So when it comes to race, how does that play into the measurements that we have today?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Is there a correlation between IQ, that what we have and what we're able to measure today, and race?
Oh, sure. I mean, and there's always been among all sorts of groups around the world. I mean, people in the Hebrides Islands off Scotland have the same IQs as blacks in the United States. And probably for similar reasons, because they're an isolated culture. And people from isolated cultures tend not to have the same achievements as people who are in cultures that have a sort of larger cultural universe to draw upon. So the data are good for measuring what is likely to happen with a given person at a given time under given circumstances. But as for the ultimate potential at the moment of conception, no one has come close to anything like that.
In Intellectuals in Race, by the way, where did this book come from?
Well, it was part of it was excerpted from a much larger study called Intellectuals in Society, which I wrote. And
why did you break out for race?
Well, because I had my research assistant had urged me to bring this out as a separate book to begin with. And I said, what does she know? And I brought it out the other way, and I realized eventually, she was right. And so I just thought, all right, now I'll belatedly bring it out the way she thought I should.
What about Asian Americans, who often seem to, as a group, perform better in school than other groups? Why is that?
I think the one four-letter word we can't use is work. And they just work. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at UCLA and I had to go on a Saturday night to the research library. And as I looked around, almost everybody I saw was Asian American. And I looked in vain for any black students there. Not many white students there. So the following week when I go to class and I find the Asian Americans better prepared, there's no real mystery to it to me. They work.
Do you teach here at Stanford?
No, I have not. I have not taught here at Stanford. When I first came here, there were little hints that perhaps I might want to sit in on seminars and things, and I never got those hints.
Do you miss teaching at all?
Yes and no. Teaching as it is today, no. Teaching as it was when I started out in 1962 at a little college in New Jersey, I really loved it. I mean, When I taught my last class at the end of the week, I would be looking forward to the next class the following Monday. Over the years, the academic world changed drastically. Now when I got the offer from the Hoover Institution, which involved no teaching at all, I said, this is it. It's sad in a sense. There are many people out there who may well have wanted to teach, but the conditions of teaching at many universities became such that it was just not worth the bother.
What's one of those conditions that changed that turned you off from teaching?
I think the attitude of the students, the faculty, and the administration, which doesn't leave much else. The students really began to think that if they showed up for class, that a B was like a constitutional right. I would get students who could come to me at the beginning of the class and say, you know, I'm a graduating senior. And I say, you believe in predestination? But they thought it was my responsibility to see that they graduated. I never took that view.
Dr. Thomas Sowell is our guest here on Book TV. We are on location at Stanford University, Hoover Institution, talking with him about his most recent book, Intellectuals and Race. How many books have you written?
You know, I haven't counted them.
I think it's about 25.
It may well be. It's as good a number as any.
So as the Milton and Rose Friedman Fellow of Public Policy here at the Hoover Institution, what is it that you do?
Well, you know, I was asked that once in a legal case where I was a so-called expert witness, and the opposing attorney says, it says here you're a senior fellow. Now, just what does a senior fellow do? And I said, actually, a senior fellow has no hours and no duties. And the judge said, you know, I wouldn't mind having a job like that.
So do you just spend the day thinking?
That's it. That's it. I once wrote someone, you know, that there's nothing but brilliant ideas from morning to night. It's just exhausting.
Dr. Sowell, when you talk about cosmic justice in Intellectuals and Race, what do you mean by that?
I guess I mean what some people mean by social justice, which is justice for groups, an initial opportunity to have the same life chances. But I call it cosmic justice because no society is able to do that or has ever done that in any country. And so what you're asking for is for life chances to be the same. When you think of all the differences, it's virtually impossible. You know, some kids are maybe raised in families that are the same economic level, but one family will have one set of attitudes toward education, and the other will not. And the one who's in the family that does not have that same attitude, he may be a fine fellow, he may be bright, all of that. He doesn't have the same chance. There's almost no way he could have the same chance.
Are goals like economic equality or economic opportunity, racial equality, are those good goals for a nation?
If you mean by equality of opportunity, yes. If you mean any belief that you're going to get the same end results, the answer is no. What those kinds of goals do is simply tear a society apart, often making all the groups in it worse off than they would have been otherwise. It's sad, affirmative action in academia, for example, takes minority students and mismatches them with institutions. For example, when I was at Cornell, the average black student enrolled at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile on the SATs. The average white student in liberal arts at Cornell at that time scored at the 99th percentile. Half the black students were on academic probation. In other words, you had kids who would have been on the dean's list at most of the colleges in this country, but they were sent to colleges where they were virtually guaranteed not to make it.
Are there any affirmative action programs that you think are worthwhile?
No. That's the easiest question of all.
Dr. Sowell, I might have just asked you this. I've already forgotten the answer. Are you working on another book right now?
This is one of the few times in my life when I do not have another book underway at the moment.
Why not?
Well, I'm always updating books that I've previously written. So if you mean that, I'm always doing that. But if you mean, am I starting on a new venture in book writing. Not for the moment.
You mentioned that at the beginning of this interview that intellectuals, in your view, should have peer approval. Or it may be approval.
No, I didn't say what they should have. I said that's what they go by. And so if they all get the same wrong idea, it becomes unstoppable.
Do you have peer approval?
I have never asked my peers whether they approve.
Why not?
I don't care.
What would you like your legacy to be when it comes to what your work over the years has created?
Well, whatever it is it's going to be, I won't be here to know it. So it really doesn't concern me that much.
Do you like doing television interviews?
Sometimes. I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it.
How well did you know Milton Friedman?
Well, I was a student of his at one time, and of course we were both here. He was the reason that I was brought to the Hoover Institution after I wrote a book called Knowledge and Decisions. Really one of the fine human beings. I often say that if you were to ask me to name someone who had both genius and common sense, I would say Milton Friedman, and then I would have to struggle to find another example.
And we've been talking with Dr. Thomas Sowell here at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Here's his most recent book, Intellectuals and Race. This is Book TV on Cspan 2.